All right. Next, I'd like to have our Colonel Don Ware come up, and he'll introduce our next speaker. Don?
Michael Cremo is a research associate of the Bhaktivedanta Institute, specializing in the history and philosophy of science. He is co-author with Richard Thompson of the controversial book Forbidden Archaeology. Michael draws his inspiration from the ancient Sanskrit writings in India, which tell of a human presence on this planet going back hundreds of millions of years. He is currently compiling a book called Forbidden Archaeology's Impact, which will include his scientific papers, academic and popular reviews of Forbidden Archaeology, selected correspondence and transcripts of selected radio and television interviews. In the course of a year, you might find Michael Cremo visiting sacred places in India, speaking to top Russian scientists at Russia's Science City, 200 kilometers outside of Moscow, appearing on Hungarian national television, or addressing a UFO organization in a casino in Laughlin, Nevada. Michael believes the world is in the midst of a major intellectual and spiritual transformation. We are renegotiating our whole picture of reality. And in the course of this renegotiation, we're also redefining the sources of intellectual authority. Today, Michael will speak about his controversial book, Forbidden Archaeology, with its evidence for extreme human antiquity. Michael Cremo.
Okay, I'll just start right now. Yeah, let's bring up the slides. So the first slide, please. So as Colonel Ware mentioned, I get my personal inspiration from the Sanskrit writings of India. And these writings tell of a human presence on this planet going back hundreds of millions of years. They also tell us that there are about 400,000 human species, not just one. And they're scattered throughout the universe. But among them are some species that very much resemble the modern scientific concept of ape men. But it's not that one kind came from the other. They've coexisted for extremely long periods of time on this planet for hundreds of millions of years. In the Sanskrit writings of India, the basic unit of time is called the day of Brahma, and the concept of time is cyclical. There's not simply one creation. Do we still have the mic? Okay, we still have it. There's a series of creations and destructions, an endless series of creations and destructions. But the basic unit of this cyclical time is called the day of Brahma. It's made up of 1,000 yuga cycles. 1,000 yuga cycles. And if you calculate that out, it comes to about 4.3 billion years. And according to these writings, we're now about 2 billion years into the current day of Brahma. So what would you predict from that, say if you were a Vedic archaeologist? What you would predict is that you should find evidence for a human presence and also for a presence of more primitive kinds of hominids going back about 2 billion years on this planet. You could also make another prediction. You could predict that because most of the researchers who are looking into this history of archaeology are committed to a different point of view, that they would tend to edit and suppress this evidence for extreme human antiquity. And what we find is that both predictions come true. On the left side of this chart, you see the standard picture of human origins on this planet. You find the beginning of life about 2 billion years ago. You find the first apes and monkeys at 40 to 50 million years ago. The first ape men, the Australopithecines, at about 4 to 5 million years ago. And you find anatomically humans like ourselves appearing about 100,000 years ago, and the first signs of civilization at about 10,000 years ago. And generally, we're told that all of the evidence that's ever been discovered goes along with this picture that you see on the left-hand side of this chart. But in my book, Forbidden Archaeology, I document extensive evidence, hundreds of cases of scientifically documented evidence showing that you have an anatomically modern human presence going back 2 billion years on this planet. But as I said, there's a process of what I would call knowledge filtration going on, something that you're very familiar with in the UFO field, whereby evidence and reports that go along with dominant orthodox ideas tend to pass very easily through the filter, and evidence and facts that tend to contradict the dominant orthodox ideas get rejected. And in archaeology, this process of knowledge filtration has been going on for about 150 years. So I document both of these things in my book, Forbidden Archaeology. It took about 8 years to put this book together. I didn't think it was going to take 8 years, but as I started looking into the vast, I was genuinely surprised to see how much of this evidence there actually is for extreme human antiquity. And I'll just comment right now that this evidence puts a human presence so far back on this planet that no idea of Darwinian evolution really makes any sense. I think if we want to understand our origins, we have to look to some kind of extraterrestrial source. And I'll be talking about that in the later part of this presentation. Now, I'm going to share with you a few of the many hundreds of cases that I've been able to document in Forbidden Archaeology. And some of these cases are going to come from the last century, and some of them are going to come from more recent times. There's a very interesting series of discoveries that was made in California during the gold rush days. Miners were going there, and they were digging tunnels into the sides of mountains. This is Table Mountain in Tuolumne County, California. And they were digging tunnels, thousands, hundreds of feet through solid rock to get at the gold-bearing deposits. And inside these tunnels, they were finding human skeletons just like ours, spear points, all kinds of stone artifacts. This is a sample of a stone mortar and pestle that was found in one of the mines. And as I said, hundreds of these artifacts were found at many dozens of different locations. It was an extensive body of evidence. Now, this particular area of California has been studied extensively by geologists, and the age of those deposits is very well known. The gold-bearing deposits at Table Mountain are from the early Eocene period. They're about 50 million years old. Now, from the standpoint of our Vedic archaeologists, to have those kinds of artifacts at roughly this period of time here, 40 to 50 million years ago, wouldn't be surprising, because we would expect to find such evidence going all the way back to 2 billion years. From the standpoint of your modern archaeologist, conditioned by the orthodox ideas, that would be very surprising because, according to their account, you should only have the most primitive apes and monkeys existing at that time, not even any of the ape men. Now, this evidence was reported to the scientific world by this man, Dr. J.D. Whitney, who was the state geologist of California at the time. He wrote a massive book about these discoveries, which was published in 1880 by Harvard University. Now, why don't we hear about these discoveries today? Why don't we see them on display in the museums? Why aren't they in the textbooks? Why aren't our children taught about them in school? That has largely to do with the influence of this scientist, Dr. William Holmes, who was a very influential anthropologist working at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. And here's what he had to say about Dr. Whitney and his discoveries. He said, "If Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of evolution as we understand it today, then he would have hesitated to announce his discoveries despite the imposing array of facts with which he was confronted." In other words, if the facts don't go along with the dominant theory, then you have to get rid of them, and you get rid of the person who reported them as well. Now, last year, I appeared on an NBC television special called The Mysterious Origins of Man, hosted by Charlton Heston and produced by Bill Coty, Carol Coty, and John Cheshire. These were the producers who were responsible for an earlier NBC television special called The Mystery of the Sphinx, featuring the work of John Anthony West and his colleagues. Now, this Mysterious Origins of Man special featured a lot of material from my book, Forbidden Archaeology. And when the producers were in the process of filming the show, I told them they should go to the Museum of Natural History at the University of California at Berkeley, where these artifacts are stored. They're not displayed, but they're stored there. So when they approached the museum officials, they were first told, the museum officials told them, well, you probably have a very tight deadline, and it would be very, I don't think we could get these things out from our storage basements in time for you to complete your program. The producer said, no, we've got plenty of time. We've got 6 months. Just bring them out. We'd like to see them. So then they were told, well, we have another problem. We have a very tight budget. We're very short on staff. We would have to pay our workers overtime to do this, and it's just not feasible at the present time. So then the producers went back to the museum officials and said, well, don't worry about that. We'll pay for it. We'll give you any amount of money. You pay your workers whatever overtime they need. We would like to film those artifacts. And they were told, finally, no, simply, we're not going to let you see them. Well, actually, it didn't stop there. This is this process of knowledge filtration. So during the process of making the film, they tried to offer all kinds of obstruction. And when the program was shown on national television, I think it was the first time in history that a major American television network had ever put out in prime time a program challenging the scientific orthodoxy about human origins. It was really and you're going to applaud even more when I tell you what happened. So there's a magazine called Science. It's a magazine that's put out by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Ha ha. And after this program came out, they published a big article. They said, nothing in recent history has outraged the scientific community more than this television program, The Mysterious Origins of Man. They were absolutely outraged. On the internet, there was a deluge of messages criticizing this program. And they also have an organization called the National Center for Science Education. And the purpose of this organization is to keep the current ideas of human origins intact in the nation's high schools. So the president of this organization, this was also in this article in the magazine Science, said, "Our telephones are ringing off the hook. We don't know what to do. Biology and science teachers from all over the country are calling us because their kids are asking them questions that they can't answer after they saw this television program." And I think that's a good thing. Why shouldn't the kids ask questions? I mean, why not? Why can't they ask questions about these things? Well, then what happened is the show was so popular that NBC announced it was going to show it again. and if you thought, there was a big outcry, after the first showing, when they heard about the second coming of this, the resurrection of it, there was, now this is actually very serious. It's not even funny, what they tried to do. And I document this in my upcoming book, Forbidden Archaeology's Impact. The scientific community went on red alert to attempt to force NBC not to show this program again. And I think 10 or 15 years ago they would have succeeded. But here's what they tried to do. They started putting out messages on the internet for anyone and everyone in the scientific community to write letters to the chairman of General Electric, which owns NBC, to write to the president of NBC, to write to the programming directors of NBC, to write to all the original sponsors of the program to try to discredit the program and to say that it was totally non-scientific and that NBC was wrong to broadcast it. And it really became a whole program. As a matter of fact, one leading scientist from the Institute for Cambrian Studies wrote to the FCC saying that the Federal Communications Commission, which controls licensing for television stations in the United States, saying that NBC should be fined a substantial amount of money for having broadcast the program, and that the money should be put in a trust fund to kind of help educate the American people and to kind of counter the sorts of ideas that you people are putting forward and the ideas that were put forward on this television program. It was really amazing. Now I have to give some credit to NBC. What they did was actually quite courageous in this particular instance. What they did is they simply said, they told the people, they put out news releases on the internet and on television saying, "Hey, everybody, watch the program that the scientists don't want you to see." So, of course, I think 10 or 15 years ago, the pressure tactics would have succeeded. I think there is a change going on in the world. As I said, we are renegotiating our whole concept of reality. Just coming over here on the airplane, I saw a liquor ad on the back of Time magazine for Absolute vodka, and it had a picture of a floating bottle of Absolute vodka against a starry background with a big legend, Absolute Roswell. So anyways, but seriously, the kinds of efforts that you're making, they are having their effect. And as I said, 10 or 15 years ago, it would have been just like Velikovsky. They would have been able to suppress the information. So anyways, that was just a little digression on the knowledge. Yes, it was. It was.
Will it be shown again?
Oh, I don't know. I think maybe they'll try to come up with something new. I mean, Bill Cote and his fellow producers will try to come up with something new, I think. Oh, total outrage. They said, well, of course, among themselves, they were exchanging messages. Boy, our letters of protest really backfired. They used it against us. But then actually, the letter to the FCC came after the second showing. And one of the things that they complained about was that NBC had had the gall to use the objections of the scientific community to promote their program to make a buck, is what they said. So anyways, let's move along here. So that was those California gold mine discoveries were from the last century, and people might say, well, maybe in the last century, people were finding such things, but today, scientists aren't finding any such things, but they are. In 1979, Mary Leakey, wife of Louis Leakey, and she recently died, but in her own right, she was one of the most prominent anthropologists in this century. She found at a place called Laetoli in the East African country of Tanzania some human footprints. And the physical anthropologists who have studied these prints say that they're no different from an anatomically modern human footprint. In other words, they're no different than the footprints that you or I might make if we were just walking on a beach today. Now, the unusual thing about these footprints is they're found in solidified volcanic ash that's been dated by the potassium-argon method to about 4 million years. Now, from the standpoint of our Vedic archaeologists, we wouldn't be surprised at all to find something like that because we're looking for a human presence going back 2 billion years. From the standpoint of your modern archaeologists or anthropologists, that would be very surprising because according to them, human beings of the type that could make footprints like that wouldn't be any older than 100 or 200,000 years at most. Now, how do they explain this? You might wonder, well, they see it, but what do they say? What they say, what Mary Leakey said, and what most of the people in the scientific community say, well, there must have been 4 million years ago in Africa some kind of ape man that had feet just like ours, and that's how the prints were made. Now, it's a very interesting proposal, but there's absolutely no physical evidence to back it up. They have the skeletons of the ape men that they say existed at that time, the Australopithecines. And they have the foot bones of those creatures, and they're very different from modern human feet. They have very long toes. Relatively speaking, about 1.5 times longer than the toes on a modern human foot. So those feet could not have made those prints. Actually, the only creature known to science today that could make prints of those types is a human being like ourselves with feet like ours. And there again, another one of the footprints from Laetoli. So there you have some evidence from this period, about 4 million years ago, and then we had the California gold mine discoveries at 50 million years ago. Now, this is another example of how this knowledge suppression goes on. This is a site at a place in Mexico called Huayatlaco. It's near the city of Puebla. And in the early 1970s, some anthropologists were digging there, and they found some very advanced stone tools in the trenches. And they want to know how old they are. So if they want to know how old something is, they call in a team of geologists. And the geologists will tell them the age of the rock deposits in which the objects were found. So they called in Virginia Steen McIntyre. She's a very courageous lady. I know her personally. And she headed up a team of 4 geologists that went to that site, and using 4 different methods, they independently came up with ages of roughly 300,000 years for that site, for the layers of rock from which those very advanced stone tools came. Now, from the standpoint of orthodox science, that doesn't make any sense at all, because according to them, human beings didn't come into North America any earlier than about 30,000 years ago at most. That's their most radical idea that they have. And most of the mainstream Orthodox scholars will accept a date of 10 to 12,000 years. But 300,000 years, they were just not prepared to accept that. So the anthropologists who were in charge of the site, when Virginia Steen McIntyre told them, all right, your site is 300,000 years old, they said, well, we can't report that. We can't do that. We can't say that. The first point is that there shouldn't have been any human beings in Mexico or North America. And the second point is there shouldn't have been any human beings anywhere in the world that could have made tools of the kind that were found there, because according to the standard accounts, such human beings should have come into existence only about 100,000 years ago or so. So what happened to her? She stuck by her guns, but she suffered professionally from it. She became labeled as a maverick and a troublemaker in her profession. She found her advancement in the U.S. Geological Survey was blocked. She lost a teaching position that she held at an American university, and she finally just had to leave her profession, and she didn't work as a geologist for about 20 years. Actually, I have to say, when I talked about her work in my book, Forbidden Archaeology, and the book started getting attention in the scientific world, that kind of inspired her to reopen the case. And I think she deserves a lot of credit for doing that. And so the original anthropologist, Cynthia Irwin Williams, who was in charge of the site, has died, and then all her papers on the site were locked up. And just recently, Virginia Steen McIntyre was able to get access to this evidence, to the file cabinets that were holding all the reports of the original anthropologists. And she found something very amazing, that all of the reports related to her dating of the site were missing. The files had been cleaned out, but that's not stopping her. She's going on, and I think we're going to see some interesting developments in this particular case. I had my own experience with this lady, Cynthia Irwin Williams, when she was still living. I had written something about the site at Huayatlaco, and I asked her for permission. I called her on the phone, and I asked her for permission to reproduce photographs of the stone tools that were found there. And she told me, I will only give you permission if you send me a letter, a signed letter, saying that you will not mention Virginia Steen McIntyre's date of 300,000 years for the site. So that's how these things work. So you see here, these aren't photographs, these are painting. These are artist renditions of the tools. So that's what I had to do in that particular case, because she wouldn't give me permission to use the actual photographs. Knowledge filtration, you see it happening all the time. Now the reports that I've given you up to this point have all been from scientific sources, from professional scientists, but I want to point out something else, and it's something you're familiar with too. If something is there, if it's actually there in the world, we can't expect that it's just scientists who are going to be seeing it. Whether it's UFOs or strange archaeological evidence, ordinary people should be encountering this evidence. And this case here is one of those cases. It's a case that happened back in the 1890s, and a woman named Mrs. Culp was putting some coal into her coal-burning stove, and one of the pieces was too big, and she broke it open, and inside she found a gold chain. And from this report, I was able to determine what mine that this coal came from. So I got in touch with the State Geological Survey of Illinois, that's where it happened, and I asked them, well, how old is the coal from this particular mine? And they told me 300 million years. Now, from the I hear some sounds of surprise. From the standpoint of a Vedic archaeologist, I wouldn't be so surprised, because A Vedic archaeologist would be looking for evidence for a human presence going back 2 billion years. So 300 million years, fine. From the standpoint of your modern archaeologist, this just, you can't even conceive it. This is from before the generally accepted time of the dinosaurs. This is from before the Jurassic. This is from the Carboniferous period, 300 million years ago.
Could you find out how old the gold necklace was?
That would be a little hard, I think.
What's the question?
The question is how could you try to directly date the gold itself? And I think that would be a little difficult.
Did she pawn it?
Well, here's what happens with this. Now, this is a very important point. The question is, did she pawn it? And see, one thing is, now this is what happens with this. Say those California gold mine discoveries, they're still there in the museum because they, somehow or other it got into the scientific evidence system. So those objects are still there, although they don't let you have access to them. Now, what happens with this evidence that's reported by that's discovered by ordinary people, and you see it's not reported in a scientific journal, it's just mentioned in a newspaper. And what happens? Mrs. Culp finds this gold chain. It doesn't go into a museum of natural history. She keeps it. She dies. It gets passed on to some relative. And then we were only able to track this down till about the 1950s. And after that, it just disappeared. And this is generally what happens to this category of evidence that doesn't make it into the standard channels where it's kept very nicely in some museum somewhere. So somebody might ask, well, okay, you have this gold chain from that period of time, 300 million years ago. Is there any evidence that human beings actually existed at that time? And there's a report from a scientific journal called The Geologist from about the year 1860 that reported that in Illinois, in Macoupin County, a human skeleton, anatomically modern, was discovered 90 feet below the surface of the ground, and right above it was a solid, unbroken layer of slate rock. So, again, from the report, I was able to determine the location of the discovery, and I again got in contact with the State Geological Survey of Illinois, and without telling them what was discovered, because if you tell them what was discovered, then you don't get a good answer from them. But I just asked them, well, how old are the layers of rock in this particular area at this particular level, 90 feet below the surface of the ground? And they said 300 million years. And sometimes when people hear about such things, they say, well, it must have been a burial or something, but people don't bury skeletons 90 feet below the surface of the ground. And in any case, the layer of rock above the skeleton was unbroken. There's no evidence that it had been broken through at any more recent time. Now, how far back does this evidence go? This is one of several hundred metallic spheres that were discovered in South Africa near a place called Ottosdalen. And there's a mine where miners are taking out a mineral called pyrophyllite. And they find hundreds of these round metallic spheres. And the unusual thing about them is these grooves that go around the equator. They're very interesting objects, a little mysterious. Now, the very unusual thing about them is they're found in the mineral deposits about almost 3 billion years old, between 2 and 3 billion years old. And after I mentioned these in my book, Forbidden Archaeology, some other authors have kind of speculated, well, how they got there. Some posit an ET involvement, some suggest time travel, but whatever explanation that you come up with, they are very interesting. So this particular object, actually we wanted to film it for The Mysterious Origins of Man, but when I got in touch with Rolf Marx, who is the director of the Natural History Museum at Klerksdorp in South Africa, when I asked him if we could film this object, he said, unfortunately, it had been stolen by a white witch. Now,
Did you say there were a lot of them?
yes, hundreds.
Did anybody ever crack it open and find out?
Yes. So the question is, have any of them been cracked open? And yes, when we showed these on the Mysterious Origins of Man, and before they were shown on the television program, they underwent a metallurgical analysis, and they could find, the metallurgists and geologists who studied them could find no good natural explanation how these objects could form, especially with those grooves around them. And they're made of a fairly, the one that was broken open is made of a fairly pure, naturally occurring kind of iron called hematite. But it's, they're metallic.
How big are they?
They're about this big. Here's one here. So, actually, I was thinking of passing these around, but I've heard, but I've heard of so many, requests for missing objects around here. Maybe I'll just have to save them for the break, and you can come up and have a look at them, over there. But one, somebody proposed, well, these are, one geologist said on the internet, said, well, these are just naturally occurring. They occur all over. And I said, well, I sent a message to him, and I said, well, send me a photograph, or send me a specimen of a round, naturally occurring metallic object with a groove. And they all have this groove going right around the equator. Not this particular, these two that I have here don't have 3 grooves, but they definitely have 1 groove going around the equator, right around the middle. So I said, send me one. If they occur everywhere and they're so common, and send me one. Send me a report about one. And he couldn't do it. This geologist could not do it. And as I said, the metallurgist who examined these things said they could find no natural explanation for them. Somebody suggested, well, that maybe the round objects existed, but then the grooves were carved in them after they came out of the ground. But the metallurgical report says there's no evidence of that. And I've got one here that's got some of the original mineral still adhering to it and filling up the groove. So it's obvious that the groove was there when these things entered those 2 to 3 billion year old mineral deposits. So I'll keep these, and maybe during the break, if anybody would like to look at them and touch them, we can do that. So what is now we're going to get into the second part of this presentation, because what this means is that the standard ideas about human origins in antiquity that we've been taught under the name of Darwinism are not really adequate to explain all of this evidence. And I think we do have to look to some kind of extraterrestrial origin. And another thing, I think if we really want to understand human origins, we have to understand what a human being really is. And I don't think we can just say that a human being is simply matter, gross physical matter. I think there's an astral body, a subtle body, and then there's also a conscious self, which in Sanskrit is called the Atma. So if you really want to understand what a human being is, it's got 3 components. And if we are able to establish this, and to tell you the truth, many of you are probably very sympathetic to these kinds of ideas, but I'm interested in also reaching people who are not already sympathetic to these ideas. So I'm always looking for ways to introduce these ideas to the more mainstream circles. So the evidence, a lot of the evidence for the existence of this picture of the human being as being composed of three elements, the material, the subtle, and the spiritual, comes from the different wisdom traditions of the world. The different shamanic traditions, for example, the different spiritual traditions. But many people, they're a little wary of this kind of evidence. They would like to see something that they could call scientific. And actually, there is some scientific evidence for this. But here again, you have this process of knowledge filtration going on. Some of the evidence for a conscious self that can exist apart from the physical body comes from the near-death experiences, the out-of-body experiences. And I guess in the UFO literature, you often find, especially in the abduction cases, some elements of the out-of-body or near-death experiences being connected with that phenomenon. These experiences tend to occur in cases of extreme trauma. There's a very nice book by a Dr. Michael Sabin, who is a cardiologist at the Emory University Medical University in Atlanta, Georgia. And he wrote a book called Recollections of Death, where he did a very systematic study of these out-of-body experiences, and he determined that they were actually real. What he did is he interviewed some of his cardiac arrest patients, and he asked them to recount details of their medical treatment. They should have been unconscious at the time, but they were able to recount exact details of the treatment that they had undergone. So he took this as kind of as an objective confirmation of the out-of-body experience stories that they were telling. So he concluded, he said, well, what is this self that appears to separate from the brain during these experiences? And he said, well, it may be the soul that some of the great spiritual traditions have always talked about. Then you get into, if there is a self that can exist apart from the physical body, that takes you naturally to the idea of transmigration of souls, reincarnation. That's the idea that the conscious self goes through the different phases of the body, and then when the body disintegrates, then it goes into another one. Dr. Ian Stevenson of the University of Virginia has studied past life memories extensively. He likes to deal with young children because children don't have the ability to make up elaborate past life stories as an adult might do. And he doesn't like to use hypnosis. He likes spontaneous reports from young children because in hypnosis sort of adds another element there where there may be some combining of elements and things like that. So what he's been able to do is in several hundred cases he's been able to actually identify the actual person, the actual past life claimed by the children. So this idea of a soul or some kind of conscious self that can exist apart from the physical body, of course you find that in all of the traditions, many of the traditions, the Christian, the Egyptian, now another idea that comes in here is that of a hierarchy. Because if there's selves that can exist apart from physical embodiment, there may be many kinds of them. As I said, the Vedas talk about 400,000 different kinds of human species existing in different levels of the universe. But this idea of a cosmic hierarchy of beings is something that is very widespread throughout the world. The Christian traditions of Europe, they have a spiritual level presided over by some kind of creator god, then intellectual level with, this would be more like the subtle material levels where you have these assistants who are taking part in these genetic manipulations and creating of planets and things like that. And then you have the things going on in our normal terrestrial level. And this is an idea you find in the Hebrew Kabbalah. You find it in the Buddhist teachings, the idea of a cosmic hierarchy of beings. Now, it's also there in the Vedic literature. At the lower levels of these hierarchies, you tend to find some very demoniac and ghostly kinds of creatures. Then you find minor demigods, spirits of that sort. You find at higher levels compassionate beings who sometimes descend to this level for the purpose of educating the beings on this level. You find at the higher levels, you find these very powerful gods in charge of the larger forces of nature and creating planets and things like that. And generally, as I said, at the top of these hierarchies, you generally find some kind of creator, original source, or godhead. In the Vedic system, you have Krishna and also consort Radha existing together, kind of a co-ed godhead. Both worship together. Now, actually from oops, a little ahead of myself. From the Vedic standpoint, you could actually make a prediction about what kind of entities should be contacting us in the present day. According to the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, since about the time of Buddha, the higher demigods and the more what we would call the mode of goodness kinds of creatures haven't been regularly visiting this planet. We're now in what is called, according to the cyclical calendar of time, the Kali Yuga, which would be a more or less dark age. And you could more or less predict that the kinds of creatures that might be visiting us from other levels in the hierarchy would be some of the darker creatures. And I think a lot of the evidence that comes from your field would tend to suggest that. Now, I'll also mention that in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, there's a lot of talk about vimanas, different kinds of spaceships. And there are many different varieties of them. There are spiritual ships, there are astral ships, and then there are metal ships, the metallic ships. And they're very extensively described. And they match up very well with a lot of the reports coming from modern UFO observations. And this is documented by Richard Thompson in his book, Alien Identities. Now, another aspect of this concept of a cosmic hierarchy is that there's communication through the different levels of this hierarchy. And this is an example from the ancient Sanskrit writings of India. This is the god Krishna speaking to the sun god. And this is taking place, this is Vivasvan, this is the sun god. And this is taking place within the interior of the sun planet. Of course, Krishna, he's from a higher dimension, a totally non-material spiritual dimension, but he's come down to this astral region to communicate some teachings to the sun god. And this took place about 40 million years ago. Then the sun god, Vivasvan, is here communicating these same teachings, which came from a higher spiritual level, to Manu. Manu, according to the Vedas, is the forefather of mankind. So we're coming down through the hierarchy. So Vivasvan this is taking place on the sun planet itself. It's not taking place on this earth. So this communication from Vivasvan to Manu is taking place on the sun planet, probably about 40 million years ago. And then Manu gives the same teachings to the terrestrial king Ikshvaku, who existed on this planet about 2 million years ago. And actually, if you go to India today, there are temples where they have little statuettes of gods that were worshipped in temples. And they say that these have been worshipped continuously on this planet since the time of Ikshvaku, about 2 million years ago. Of course, if you look in the modern textbooks, they say, well, Indian civilization began about 1500 BC. You go to these temples in India, and they don't tell you that. They tell you that the temples have been there for millions of years.
Has anybody done carbon dating on these temples?
Well, the question is, has anybody done carbon dating on the temples? Now, carbon dating won't work because carbon dating just goes back 50,000 years. And say if you have something that's millions of years old, but it has even the slightest bit of modern carbon on it, it'll show a date of 50,000 years or 10,000 years because it's contaminated with modern carbon. But now, John Anthony West and I were talking about this, and there's an interesting new method that's been developed in England. And it's a form of isotope dating. And what this allows you to do, I think it's chlorine-39 or something like that. There's an isotope of chlorine. So if you have a quarry that has a certain type of rock, if you take the rock out, it gets exposed to cosmic rays, and it starts accumulating this isotope. So, and this has actually been used to date some of the structures in Egypt. But say if you have a quarry, and then you have a building that's made from stone from that quarry that you're absolutely certain is a certain age. That's definitely written on it. It was built in a certain point in time. And then you have a third building built from stone from the same quarry by triangulation, by knowing, by dating the virgin rock, the amount of the isotope in the virgin rock, dating the amount in the building of known age, you can make a triangulation and get the age of a third building of unknown age made from rock of the same quarry. So that would be, I think, the only method right now that could possibly be applied to stone structures to tell you actually how old they are. So we'll see if that could happen. But to get back to the point I was developing here, we've talked a little bit about, other speakers have talked about, kind of genetic manipulations of higher beings being involved in the production of our human species on this planet, and probably other species as well. That's I accept that totally, but I'm always looking for things that will make that plausible to others who maybe aren't so sympathetic to the idea. And I think one area where we get some evidence for this is from the alternative medicine, from different kinds of healing that go on. Because here we can see the action of higher beings, perhaps, on our own organisms even today. So many of you will recognize this as Lourdes in France. And the story there is that in the last century, a girl was there and some goddess appeared to her, and of course she interpreted it as the Virgin Mary. But all over the world, in India and Ireland, everywhere, Mexico, you find reports of healing goddesses. So perhaps because it was Christian Europe, either the goddess presented herself in that way or the girl interpreted her that way. Who she actually was, who knows? But it was apparently some kind of goddess from some higher dimension who appeared there. And people go there to this grotto today to be healed. And of course, they're not being healed by the water in the spring there. That's not what they think is going on. They think that somehow or other, even today, the influence of that higher dimensional goddess is still operating in that area. And what's interesting about Lourdes is that they actually have an institute there of physicians who for about 100 years have been documenting the cases of cures there. They get medical reports before and after on the people, so they're building up quite an interesting body of evidence. And just one of the cases there was a case of a French worker who had an extreme case of varicose veins, very terrible. And this was documented beforehand. It was incurable. Nothing could be done. And then he went and he took a bath in the waters at Lourdes, and soon thereafterwards there was a complete physical transformation of the legs of that person. And medically that just couldn't be explained. So there was some actual physical transformation going on under the influence of some kind of higher dimensional being. So I think this whole area of alternative medicine, different kinds of healing, it offers a nice body of evidence that can help sway people who aren't already sympathetic to these kinds of ideas. So basically, what we find going on, if we put all these elements together, is what I call a process of devolution, where you have some higher beings. In the Vedic system, it would be Krishna, who produces Brahma, who is the first demigod. And then from Brahma comes the first sexually reproducing pair, Manu and Shatarupa, his consort. And Brahma also produces mental sons, sons just coming from his mind. So then you get the daughters of Manu and Shatarupa mating with these mental sons of Brahma and producing different lines of sages and demigods till you come down to Daksha, who was a sage existing at a higher dimensional level of reality. And then his daughters, the daughters of Daksha, there are about 30 of them, are paired with different demigods and sages who have resulted from these earlier combinations. And from them are produced, by a process of what I would call guided genetic engineering, all of the other species, the human beings of our type, the plants, the animals, and everything else. And it is stated that these daughters of Daksha and their consorts don't invent these creatures. They engage in a process of reproduction, but they use seeds. They're called bija in Sanskrit. It means seeds that have come down from some higher level. And by their reproductive processes, they're able to use these seeds. Now, scientifically speaking, they've already been able to actually store sperm from one animal in the testicles of another. This is something that's already been done. So you have these seeds which contain the programs for the construction of the bodies of the different kinds of entities being passed down from some intelligent designer. And then there's a process of reproduction with modification going on, which is Darwinian in one sense, because that's what Darwin said. He said, well, you've got reproduction with modification going on. But the problem with Darwin's system is you can't explain where you get the first self-reproducing thing just from chemicals. It's very difficult if you really try to analyze it. And then how you get the transitions from one form to another is also not explained very well, because they also have the idea of the seed, or the DNA, which codes for the body. But it's a very complicated program. And if you try to go from one form to another by simply randomly changing the program, it really doesn't work very well from an engineering standpoint. Say if you had some very complicated software, like most of the big international corporations, they use for their accounting an accounting software that's developed by a company in Germany. Even IBM and Microsoft use it. They don't use their own software. They use this software that was developed by a German company, because it's very complicated to deal with all the monetary transactions, francs, marks, this, taxes in all the different countries, inventory, etc. So if you can imagine, if you were simply to try to change that program by randomly changing some of the lines in it and hope you're going to get something better, it really doesn't work. So this system of what I call devolution actually works a little bit better because you've got some intelligence that's involved in the process. But still, it's Darwinian in the sense that you've got reproduction going on with modification. You've also got extraterrestrial contacts going on, and you also have some kind of overall design and control of the system. So basically, I call it devolution. You have the evolutionary idea, which really doesn't work too well, and you've got the devolutionary idea, where you have, and it's actually a little complicated, because remember, we're not dealing strictly with matter. We're dealing with three things. We're dealing with a conscious self, which comes from this higher level, and then you've got added onto it a subtle astral body, which comes in the middle level, and then finally, when it comes down to this level, you've got the gross physical body added onto it. Now, this is an idea that also had its place in Western history. You had, the idea of the Platonic forms, where you have some forms existing on some higher dimensional level of reality that are translated into a lower level by the agency of what was called the demiurge. So basically, what you have going on in this process of devolution is you're starting out with forms that exist on some higher dimensional spiritual level of reality that are, and there's a process of gradual densification or condensation that's going on where different things are added on to the original spiritual template. You get the astral element added on, and finally the gross physical element added on. And so that's this process, as I said, of devolution. So you can say the Darwinian idea is one of evolution by material processes on this planet. And this process of devolution, which I'm going to be explaining in my next book, Human Devolution, is one of descending from some higher spiritual level. And we're meant to go back to the original level, and I would call that revolution. So this whole picture that I've outlined to you, starting out with the anomalous archaeological evidence and the second part going into this idea of devolution, it actually makes good sense from a scientific standpoint. Because one of the hallmarks of a good scientific theory is that it should let you naturally accommodate evidence from many different sources and bring them together in a very natural way without any kind of arbitrary manipulation of the data set. And I think this idea that I've outlined to you today really lets you do that. It lets you naturally accommodate all of the archaeological evidence that's been found over the past 150 years. The modern orthodox scientists, they have to arbitrarily exclude vast quantities of evidence. I gave you a few cases here today. Actually, I could keep you here for several weeks, going over case after case after case, of this evidence. And another thing that this picture allows you to do, it allows you to naturally accommodate all kinds of evidence for what are now called paranormal or supernatural phenomena, which to me are just another variety of natural phenomena. But it lets you accommodate all of this, whereas your orthodox scientists and scholars, they have to arbitrarily exclude a lot of this very, very compelling evidence. So that brings me to the end of this presentation, and I would like to use the rest of the time for your questions, if you have any. So could we bring up the lights in the house?
When will your book be available?
Okay, so somebody asked, when will my book be available? Well, actually, there's two books. There's the book Forbidden Archaeology's Impact, which documents, say, all the responses to that NBC television show and so many other responses to the book. Because this book, Forbidden Archaeology, has attracted a lot of attention in the scientific world. It's been reviewed extensively in all the mainstream journals of anthropology and archaeology and history of science. So I'm putting all those reviews into that book along with my responses. I'm also presenting in that book all of the papers that I've given at scientific conferences related to the book. I've spoken at the World Archaeological Congress. I just got back from Europe where I spoke at the 20th International Congress for the History of Science. I've spoken to the Russian Academy of Sciences and things like that. So all those papers will be in that book. And then also all of the reviews and articles from the alternative science community will be in the book. And then I have a correspondence of several hundred letters with scientists and philosophers and other people about the book, and many of the people have given me permission to reproduce their correspondence, so I'm putting that in, and then also some radio and television interviews. So that book I'm finished with, and it'll be in print in the bookstores in spring 1998. The other book, Human Devolution, I'm still working on, and actually my coming here and hearing what all you have to say is part of my process of doing my research for that upcoming book. And I would like it to be out in 1999, but we'll see. Yes, sir?
Yes, I had a question. I've heard that many of the things in modern archaeology, like the skulls and things where they've supposedly derived the various pictures we have of ancient man, were derived from very small fragments of the body itself. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so the question is a lot of the evidence that has been used to build up the standard scientific account, has that been very fragmentary? And the answer to that question is yes. It has been very fragmentary, and there's a lot of imagination and speculation that goes into this. For example, I'll just give one example. The very first so-called missing link that was discovered was the Java man, discovered in the 1890s by Eugene Dubois, who was a Dutch physician who was actually looking for the missing link, and he went from Holland to the Dutch East Indies to specifically do this. And what he found was two things. The first thing he found was a skull fragment, not a complete skull, but just the top part of a skull that appeared to have some very heavy eyebrows. So he found that in one place. And then the next year, about 15 yards away, he found a thigh bone, which looked sort of like a human rather than an ape thigh bone. And I don't know, I guess you just have to think, like how far away 15 yards is. Because if I walk across here, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If I took another 7 steps that way, that would be 45 feet or 15 yards. So, and in that deposit, there were hundreds of bones from all kinds of animals and fish and turtles, and all mixed together. So what he did is he took the sort of ape-like skull fragment that he found one year, and then combined it with the thigh bone that he found 15 yards away a year later, and put them together and said, oh, well, this is an ape man. Now, I mean, it's not that I think that ape men didn't exist. I think they did exist, but this is it's a very interesting case. So he put the two together, and he said, yes, well, this must have been an ape man. And then he made elaborate statues of this, just from these two bones. Two bones. He made very lifelike paintings and statues, and they were, a lot of propaganda was made about it. What most people don't know is that in the 1970s, some British scientists actually looked at the thigh bone, and they determined it was not from an ape man. It was identical, absolutely identical to an anatomically modern human thigh bone. Now, the deposits in which these things were found are about 800,000 years old. So what it appears that you have is evidence for perhaps an ape man and an anatomically modern human coexisting 800,000 years ago in Java. But they don't want to hear about that. They don't. It's kind of interesting. They say, well, maybe the human bone got mixed in from above. Well, then maybe that ape-man skull got mixed in from above, too. And maybe you've got ape men still around with us today, which takes you into the whole subject of Bigfoot and Sasquatch, which is a whole chapter about in my book, Forbidden Archaeology. So it appears that what we've got is coexistence rather than evolution going on. Yes, ma'am?
You mentioned that the 2.8 billion-year-old metal balls had been cut open, but you didn't tell us what was inside.
Oh. Well, we cut open one of them, and it was solid. It was solid iron ore all the way through, the one that was cut open. Now, I have a few specimens myself in addition to the ones that I've got here, and I'd be willing to have more of them cut open, to see what might be inside. I don't know. There must have been some reason why this white witch was interested in them. I'd also been told that they would rotate in the museum case without anybody touching them. That was a report that I heard. Yes?
There's an article in the Arizona Gazette from, I believe it's 1905, a very large article about an explorer who was employed by the Smithsonian Museum who was in the Grand Canyon and discovered a huge cavern in there that appeared to have things like hieroglyphs, Egyptian-type artifacts, and the Smithsonian had a big, within this article they said they were funding this large expedition to go in and research this whole cave, and as far as I know, very little has been heard about this since that time. I've written to the Smithsonian asking them about it. I haven't received a reply at this point, but I was wondering if perhaps you knew anything about this.
Yes, I have that report myself, and I've also been trying to track down somehow or other, because certain people are named there as researchers. And I've been trying, like one of them is said to have been from Idaho. So I've been asking around Idaho, through different sources to see if anybody knows this person, has ever heard of them. In other words, this work, it's sort of like detective work. And this is why it took me 8 years to put together Forbidden Archaeology. So I'm aware of that report, and I've also been, I don't think you're going to get a very much of an answer from the Smithsonian Institution. But if anybody else knows about that and knows anything, I'd certainly like to hear it. But I've been trying to track down more information about that case myself, but thus far I haven't, none of the leads have led me to anything. But it's certainly a very interesting case.
Hi, I had a comment first and then a question. When I was at UC Berkeley, I took a couple of courses with Professor Tim White.
Yes, Tim White.
And he's known as one of the foremost bone specialists in the area of forensic archaeology. And one of the things that he always used to tell us is when he used to travel down to the Afar region of Africa, he always noticed that he would come in and find, let's say, a certain type of bone, and then his time would shorten. He would have to come back and make, come back to Berkeley and teach. And when he would come back the next year, because they wouldn't put any kind of soldiers around to protect the area, he would see that there are more excavation that are done. And so basically he was estimating that about any kind of research that's done in terms of archaeology and bone finding, at least 9/10 of it doesn't even get to the majority of the public or museums for anybody to study. Second part, which was a question that I had, that is, anytime we see anybody coming forward with certain kind of truth that kind of goes in the face of the accepted quote-unquote paradigm, you see that the people who are coming with this kind of information are usually they're subjected to threats on their lives or their possessions, or you usually find some sort of a spook or cloak and dagger types coming forward and either trying to ridicule the person or in some famous cases, people like Phil Klass, who are reported to be on the dole of the CIA, or Carl Sagan, and the list goes on, come and try to impugn the reputation of the person. I wanted to know what your experiences were in this regard, because the type of things that you have talked about have definitely created uproar.
Yes, so, no, you're absolutely right. The powers that be, whoever they are, do try to use different methods to either silence or discredit people who report things that shouldn't be reported. Now, one thing that I take some support from is the knowledge that within the universe there are powers for good as well as evil, you might say. So, so I'm sort of, confident that maybe I'm part of some conspiracy, that's a good one, and that there are certain powers that are backing me, just as there might be, powers backing others. So I don't feel paranoid at all. Nevertheless, I find it interesting. From the very beginning of my work, I was determined not only to report the evidence, but to use my book, say, as a probe to explore the nature of whatever forces are out there, trying to keep things a certain way or push things in a certain direction. Use it as sort of a flare. Like say if you're out at night and you don't know what's out there, then you can send up a flare and poof, see what's out there. So from the very beginning, that is what I've tried to do with my work. Not only gather the evidence, for extreme human antiquity and other things, but also study very carefully what happens in the process of gathering the evidence, seeing who tries to suppress it, who tries to help you, and then when it comes out, see what happens and document that. That's why I'm bringing out this book, Forbidden Archaeology's Impact, which I consider just as important as the original book itself, because that book will document exactly what you're saying. Now, I think one of the most effective tactics that can be employed against uncomfortable evidence is silence. Say, if you have, I like to use this example. It's, you go to the Western Saloon and you're having a gunfight. You know, there's a gunfight going to happen, maybe. So, say you have this guy named Boss. He's in the saloon with his black hat on. And then some other guy comes in to the saloon, Jake. So Jake wearing his white hat says to Boss, "Draw, partner." Now, what can he do? Okay, so one thing that Boss can do is simply say, just look, turn away, go back to the bar, just ignore the person, right? And that's a signal that, well, your challenge just isn't even worth responding to. Now, of course, if he can get away with that, that's good, if he can get away with it. But then, what if his friends are there and saying, "Well, what's the matter, Boss? You afraid of the guy?" Then he's got to respond. He has to respond to the challenge. And then it's a question of who's the best shot, when it's all over. So I think we have to expect that if we say challenging things or print challenging things that challenge dominant orthodox ideas, that one attempted response will be just ignore it. Like, what you're saying is not even worth considering. So I think forbidden archaeology, of course a lot of the work that you're doing has kind of gone beyond that stage, where they realize that you can't just be silent and try to ignore it because it's not going to go away. So it's come to the point of, I would say, confrontation. And we'll have to see, what happens in the end. What I think is going to happen is, as I said, as was said in the introduction, is that we're in the process of renegotiating our whole picture of reality. And I think even these opponents are going to have to be part of that renegotiation. They're going to have to be brought into the process of renegotiating it. And in the end, we're going to have a different picture of reality and new sources of authority. People are going to be looking towards other people if they want to know what the nature of reality actually is. So I think that's what's going to happen. And specifically, sometimes people, they try to respond with just ridicule. They don't want to respond to the evidence. So I've seen that sort of thing. Like Richard Leakey said about my book, says, "Pure humbug. Nobody will take it seriously but a fool." He doesn't address the evidence. And there's others who have had that kind of reaction. Actually, I used that. I put his statement on the abridged version of my book, and it actually sold a lot of copies. So. And I got on a lot of radio and television shows because of it too. So. And then also, I've been able to use those things. I've been able to go to, for example, I went to a conference, academic conference on science and culture that was held at Kentucky State University a couple of years ago. And I presented the different kinds of reactions to my book, Forbidden Archaeology, including these simply infantile name-calling kind of reactions coming from so-called academics and scholars. And intelligent people, even within the academic community, they can see that, well, that's not a very intelligent way for someone to behave. They can see that. So I'll turn it against them. That's what I do with it. When they react like that, I turn it against them. Just like with the NBC television show, we turned it against them. Their attempts to poo-poo it and put it down, we turned it against them. So that's my strategy.
Concerning the metal spheres,
Yeah.
I have some questions. I'd like to know if anyone has asked those questions, and if they have asked those questions, what the response was.
Okay.
First of all, how did they know who took the spheres? What do they mean by a white witch? What are they talking about? If they know who took the spheres, why haven't they gotten them back?
This is just one sphere that was taken.
Well, one.
One.
And why? Why were they taken? And why haven't they gotten them back? Just
I
those
don't know
6 questions.
Yeah. I don't know the answers to any of them, but I think they're very good questions.
Oh, another gentleman here wants to know, has anyone have any evidence, such as videotape, the sphere is moving?
I've never seen any evidence in the form of videotape for them moving. That was just a report from South Africa. And the other questions, I think they're all very good. That was just, what I reported to you was the response I got from Rolf Marx, who is the director of the museum, when we were thinking of going down there to film that particular object, the one with the 3 grooves around it. It's a very interesting object. Yes?
It's about the Mitchell Hedges skull or any of the other skulls.
Okay, you have to explain to me what that is.
It's a crystal skull that was found in Lubantan.
Oh, the crystal skulls.
Yes.
I have those reports of the crystal skulls in my collection. I didn't give a lot of attention to them because when I was putting together my book, Forbidden Archaeology, I was specifically interested in evidence for extreme human antiquity, you know, human fossils and things like that. So I didn't carefully look into those reports, which I do have. For my next book, Human Devolution, I think they may be of interest, and I'll just have to look into them. I haven't looked into them carefully, so I can't really comment on them.
I have 2 questions for you. First of all, am I to understand that the material that these spheres are comprised of was a hematite? Is that?
That was the laboratory analysis of the one that was given to them for analysis. Now, others may be of some other substance, but the one that they split open and conducted their analysis on, that's what they said it was.
Have they, okay, this is actually still part of the first question.
Yeah.
Has it been tested at all for any magnetic properties? Does it respond to magnetics, or does it contain magnetic properties?
Okay, I've got a sign there that says time is over, but we'll just finish this question because it is 6 o'clock.
It's really good.
And I like to start and end on time. So at the last conference I was at, I met a gentleman who asked the same kinds of questions that you're asking, and he has access to a laboratory where he can do those kinds of testing. So I'm going to send him another sample, and he's promised to do mass spectrometry on it and also to look into the magnetics of it. Okay, so I'll be... One more, okay.
This concerns getting information to the public and the public getting accurate information. More than 50 years ago, I decided that newspapers only compound the confusion with commotion, so I quit reading them. I find that today's news, particularly TV, is entertainment. Push the mute button and you'll understand that better. Now, the only information I've been able to trust comes in books. Not all books, but if I can trust it, I find it's generally in a book. Now, your effort in that field seems to bear that out. Am I correct?
No, I didn't hear the very last thing that you said. I heard everything except the very last phrase.
Your experience in the publishing field seems to bear that out, that the only accurate information is coming through in books, such as yours.
Well, I think one has to use a lot of, I mean, even reading, we can't just accept anything that's there in a book. But in books, I think you get a lot more depth of information and a lot more verification of sources and things of that kind than you can get in your average television program. So yes, on that point, I would agree with you. So thank you all very much. You're welcome.
Wonderful.